I am Daniel Lucas, and welcome to Book 101. Book 101 is all about the books that I read for the last 40 years, and today I have my special guest. He's the author of several books, no other than Mr. Cody Engdahl.
Hello, Mr. Cody.
Hello, Daniel. How you doing?
I'm fabulous like you. Let's do the recap of what we talked about for the last 3 weeks or 4 weeks.
Yeah, we've been around. So we've talked about most of my series. We so I My series is basically it's a trilogy in the American Civil War, and then there's a prequel that takes place beforehand that features the Mexican American War. But we talked about the Civil War trilogy, and it's basically the trilogy follows the Second Michigan Cavalry through the Civil War in the Western Theater, and all the not all, but it maps out their career during the war, and the my characters are interwoven into like the real history, the real battles, and the real historical characters. And the book, even though it follows the Second Michigan, I have heroes and villains on both sides because what it's really about is friends who get separated by the war and end up on opposite sides, but they're still friends. And so a lot of what my trilogy is about is people dealing, real human beings dealing with being caught in the middle of politics, geography, and at the same time being having friendships that are on the opposite sides and family and all that. So I feel like it's a very powerful story. The first two novels follow. Well, I'll tell you this: the first novel starts with three friends who, at the beginning of the war, they're going to school in Detroit, and one of the kids has to go back to Tennessee to go fight for to go fight for his state and fight for the Confederacy, and the other two are left in Detroit. Well, one of them gets in trouble and joins the army, or has to either join the army or go to jail, and he ends up, he's kind of the lead. He's the lead character in the first two books. The third friend was a wealthy black kid who came from a family that had been in Detroit since the time of the French. His father's a wealthy fur trader. And even though Francis is very well educated and comes from money, he's a ballroom dance instructor. He feels like he's been left out. He feels like a fish out of water because he doesn't fit in with anybody. He doesn't fit in with his white friends. He doesn't fit in with other blacks. He's kind of an outsider. So he feels in the beginning of the trilogy he's frustrated because he feels like this war is his fight, and yet he's not allowed to participate because in the beginning of the war blacks were not allowed to join the army, but then after the Emancipation Proclamation, blacks were allowed into the army. So in the third book, he and his new friend Elijah, who you meet in the first book, Elijah is a runaway slave who ends up becoming good friends with the main character and goes on adventures. Those two are up in Detroit and they decide that they're going to go down south. They're going to go to Memphis and they're going to join one of the new black regiments that's going to fight in the war. And so the first part of Blood for Blood at Nashville is their story about how how they go down, they join, they get their training, and they end up in the Battle of Fort Pillow, which is also known as the Massacre at Fort Pillow. And Fort Pillow was a terrible thing. It's a dark day for American military history. Basically, according to the congressional investigation afterwards, that the rebel army that showed up at Fort Pillow came over the walls and killed men even after they were trying to surrender. They were targeting black soldiers, which at that time the Confederacy had a rule that any black found in uniform fighting against the Confederacy would be considered a slave insurrection and could be summarily executed. And if not summarily executed, they could be apprehended and sold back into slavery. So the stakes are pretty high for these two.
Yes, indeed. And today we're gonna talk about Blood for Blood at Nashville.
Yes, yes. So that first part of Blood for Blood is that story of Francis and Elijah, and part one, which could have been a book into itself. Part one starts with the massacre, the beginning of the massacre at Fort Pillow, and then goes back and tells their story. But not only does it tell their story, but it also tells the story of the very real General Nathan Bedford Forrest, who many people who know about the American Civil War are familiar with him. He was a very formidable cavalry leader of the Confederacy. And it tells his story as well as all the steps along the way, all the true and the real things that happened, starting with his fight with his commander, Braxton Bragg, after the Battle of Chickamauga, and having a family member die in his arms, the humiliation he feels when he tries to take Paducah and he's turned away by black troops, to finally this rage by the time he arrives at Fort Pillow and orders his men over the wall. And so that's part one of the book. And then I don't want to spoil too much, but things go it was a dark day at Fort Pillow. And that sets up the rest of the book, which is really a revenge book, a revenge story. And we come back to our hero, Carl, who was the main character of the first two books. Carl gets the terrible news of what happened to his friend, and he is on a rage that sends him on a quest for revenge, where he's going to go back down south and he's going to hunt down the man, Latham Woods, the man who particularly did something terrible to his friend. And it's interesting, and there's some twists and turns, and I don't want to give too much away, but at some point, Carl will end up being in the Confederate Army as well, and learn to see what kind of the point of view that they're coming from. Because when I write books about wars, I don't write about good guys and bad guys, because there's plenty of those on both sides. I write about real people, and it's always a human story. So we follow that story of him trying to find the man who did this to his friend, and because he wants to kill him. It's no longer about the war. He doesn't care about the war. He only cares about the revenge for what happened to his friend. Eventually, the third part of the book is the whole Nashville campaign, where General John B. Hood crosses the Tennessee River and invades Tennessee, just kind of like a Caesar did crossing the Rubicon at the beginning of the Roman Civil War. And there's very little resistance between Alabama and Nashville, and so there's a scramble for the Federals to get enough men to Nashville to defend the capital from the advancing Confederate Army. And of course, if you're a buff of the Civil War, we do the Battle of Franklin, and then of course the Battle of Nashville, where not only does this basically the Civil War ends in the Western Theater, but the saga that started at the beginning of the trilogy comes to its conclusion as a very dramatic and I think very satisfying conclusion. And just so you know, like, the Battle of Nashville is considered to be one of the most decisive battles in the war. It basically ended the war in the Western Theater. And 4 months after the Battle of Nashville, Robert E. Lee would surrender to Ulysses S. Grant at the Appomattox courthouse, which most people consider that to be the end of the war altogether. So, yeah, it's a big book. It's probably as long as the first two books combined.
Yes, and according to Sherry, a great read. Mr. Cody, Blood for Blood at Nashville, what are the elements that you put in the story to make this novel great?
Yeah, so a lot of things. Every novel I do, I try to explore something new and interesting. So there's two things that I was very interested in. Was the colored troops, and that's what they called them back then. They were the U.S. colored troops, the U.S. CT. And in fact, I have friends that are reenactors that reenact some of these units because I think it's a very fascinating part of the war. These are we talk about fighting for our freedom, a lot. They throw that around, but these are men that were truly fighting for their freedom. These were brave black men who many of which had been born into slavery, that were threw off their chains, and it was different. If you were a white soldier fighting for the Union, and you got captured, well, you might go to a prison camp. They might parole you, but if you were black, they had passed a law that they could summarily execute you on the spot, or take you into custody and sell you into slavery. So these men were risking everything, and they were risking it not just for their own freedom, but for the freedom of other people that were enslaved. So I think they're fascinating, and I think it's a story that you don't get to hear a whole lot. The movie Glory is great, that talks about them as well. The other thing I do a lot of show and tell because I'm fascinated with history in historical military, and so I wanted to the unit that my two heroes join is I think it's the sixth U.S. Colored heavy artillery. So they're gunners, cannons. And so I really got into, the first two books were about cavalry. These guys are artillery, and so we go through like the steps of how they fire the guns and how the guns work and the different kinds of guns, and like I said, I like to do show and tell quite a bit, and so I had a lot of fun studying Civil War artillery, how the guns work, and then relaying that in the books.
Mr. Cody, do you have other option for the title Blood for Blood at Nashville?
Sometimes when I have a winner, I just go with it. And so every single book, I started with the title already. And I like, the first book. One of the things I do is I don't think that you should be overly creative with titles, because I think the title you should have a good idea of what you're about to read from the title, especially in today's market when you're trying to sell books on Amazon. You only got like a few seconds before people scroll past you. So your cover and your title should really tell people what they're about to read. So, and I like alliteration too. So Rampage, my first book, Rampage on the River, the Battle for Island Number 10, you're going to know that the Battle of Island Number 10 is the marquee battle in this. The Perils of Perryville, my second book, the marquee battle is the Battle of Perryville. And the Battle of Nashville is the marquee one here too. And it was called Blood for Blood because it's really, that's the big trope that's in this book. It's a revenge story. And we set the first a third of the book setting up the reason why. My goal was to make you fall in love with these characters and then break your heart so that you feel the sorrow and the rage that my main character feels, so that you understand why he's going to walk away from his comfortable life, because he was injured in the previous book and he was out of the war. But then now it's his own war that he's going to go and fight for. And so yeah, I liked Blood for Blood because that right there tells you it's a revenge story, And Blood for Blood at Nashville tells you that the marquee battle at the end of the book is the decisive battle of Nashville.
Well, let's talk about the main character of Blood for Blood.
Yes. So, and that starts off, it starts off, it's Elijah. I'm sorry, not Elijah. Elijah is one of them, but um, Francis Bethune is he's a well-educated, very agile, uh, wealthy black kid who he's one of the things I did with him, and I thought this was a lot of fun, is I made him effeminate. He's kind of girlish, he's into dancing and one of the things that motivates Francis is once again he feels like a fish out of water. He doesn't quite fit in with his wealthy white friends. He doesn't fit in with other blacks in the city. And he's also not terribly masculine, even though he's a great fighter. He's a expert at savate, which is a French version of kickboxing. He's very agile because he's a dancer, and this is a time where being masculine and is being a tough guy and a fighter. So I feel like Francis has so much to prove, and I really wanted people to like love him and understand his own insecurities and why he feels the need to go out and put himself in harm's way to fight for a cause that's bigger than himself. And then because of what happened, and because I hope that you really connect with him, then you understand why Carl, who's the main character of the whole trilogy, why in part 2 and part 3, he has this absolute rage and this need to right this wrong and to get revenge, to avenge his friend that he tried so desperately to talk out of, going to war in the first place. So yeah, the second and third part is Carl, who's the main character. Carl is a guy who grew up with a wealthy single mother. His father died in the Mexican War, or was lost in the Mexican War. He grew up not knowing who his dad is, not knowing who his family is, only knowing that he was kind of growing up in a comfortable but lonely life. Never wanted to be in the war in the first place, got forced into the war in the first book. But like I said, now because of a tragedy, now the war is something very personal to him. It's no longer a burden. It's something that he's seeking out. And it's something also he's learning about himself.
Interesting, Mr. Cody. But before we go on, I want to shout out to the people listening in South Korea. Annyeonghaseyo, South Korea. In Incheon, I got 93% audience share. Seoul at 10%. North Gyeongchang at 1%. Gyeongsangbuk-do at 1%. And Gyeonggi-do at 1%. Thank you so much, South Korea. Annyeonghaseyo for supporting this podcast, because this podcast is created to empower writers all over the world, like Mr. Cody Engdahl.
I'd like to say to our friends over there in South Korea, Annyeonghasimnika.
Yes, indeed. So, Blood for Blood at Nashville, if you compare to the perils of Perryville, what's the big difference?
Yeah, so the perils, very interesting question. So the perils of Perryville, each book has its own story, but all three of the books combine for an overall larger story. And the idea behind the perils of Perryville was after I wrote Rampage on the River, which was my first novel. The challenge I had was, okay, I wrote a great novel. Do I have it in me to write another one, a follow-up to it? And so I did Perils of Perryville. And the idea behind the Perils of Perryville was, okay, all this stuff happened in the first book. So what would be the ramifications of that? What would be the consequences of the things that the characters did in the first book? How would they resolve them, or what consequences would they suffer or pay for what they did in the first book? So in a way, even though Rampage and Perils are both complete stories in themselves, Perils kind of closes the loop. It creates a a narrative loop from the beginning of Rampage to the end of Perils. And I could have stopped it right there. But then when I wrote Blood for Blood at Nashville, I had to start it's the same characters, but I had to start a new story. And so that's why Blood for Blood at Nashville is twice as long as the other two books, because it creates its own story in which now Francis, who had been kind of a side character in the first two books, gets the center stage, and we tell his story. And of course, then we tell the story about what happens after Francis's story. It's a big book. It's 119,000 words. I think that comes out to about maybe 500 pages. I can't remember, but it's an epic. And the other thing about it was, the challenge about Perils of Perryville was, am I capable of writing a good sequel? And I believe I did. And the next challenge was, this was always supposed to be a trilogy, even though there are other books afterwards, but the Civil War part of this saga was always supposed to be a trilogy. So the challenge with Blood for Blood was, can I land the plane? Can I wrap this trilogy up with a final third book that was going to be very satisfying in not only concluding the American Civil War, but also the story that I started with the first novel.
How did you crafted Blood for Blood at Nashville, Mr. Cody?
Yeah, so I broke it into basically three acts, and Act One is basically the Act One sets up the next two acts. So Act One is kind of like the prelude in which we follow this story about Francis and his adventure in the war. And Act One could have been a novel into itself had I wanted to do that. Act Two is Carl finding out what happened to his friend and going on this quest for revenge, and ending up going on an adventure that he did not expect. And what's interesting is every one of these acts ends with a big battle or a big cliffhanger. So the end of Act One is the massacre at Fort Pillow. End of Act Two is the second battle of Memphis, in which Nathan Bedford Forrest and his troops raided Memphis, and they were trying to kidnap federal generals. And then Act Three is the whole Nashville campaign, in which the Army of Tennessee, commanded by General John B. Hood, invade Tennessee and march on Nashville, and the frantic struggle to defend the capital, all while Carl's own story is also coming to its final conclusion. So one of the big important things, when you talk about historical fiction, and there's a lot of us writers, we all have different kind of styles in how we mix the real history with our stories. And there are some people like Jeff Shera who basically is just novelizing the real history. And then we have other people who just write their own story and use history as a backdrop. I try to make my books to be like almost 50-50, where the historical plot and my plot are equal and interwoven with each other. So Blood for Blood at Nashville is in three parts, and it really is just wrapping up the story of the American Civil War in the Western theater, all while wrapping up the story of all my characters that you met in the first book: Francis, Carl, Kyle, Elijah, Catherine, and Liza. These are characters that, if you read the first two books, that you would, hopefully you've come to know and love and be interested in and want to know what happens next with it.
Mr. Cody, what behind Blood for Blood at Nashville?
What's behind it?
Yes.
A story of humanity. Like for example, Nathan Bedford Forrest is a very controversial person. He is a man who became a self-made millionaire by buying and selling other human beings. He was a slave trader. He is he was in command of a force that committed war crimes at Fort Pillow. He is the first after the war. He was the first Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. So we're talking about a guy who is not remembered fondly by a lot of people, but some people do remember him fondly because he was an interesting person. He had somewhat of a redemption arc in real life, especially towards the end of his life, in which he became a champion of racial harmony and equal rights for blacks. A lot of people don't know that story, and I like people or characters that are complex. So he's kind of a villain in this story for sure, but he's also kind of a hero, and I think he was a very interesting, very scary person to write about because he's controversial. So you're going to make people angry if you glorify him, and some people are going to make angry if you vilify him. But if you tell the truth, the real person that he was, I think you'll find a very complex and interesting character. And we even do. There's an epilogue that is a true story about him that happened 10 years after the war. Um, it was 10 years after the war, and about 2 years after, or 2 years before he ended up dying. He was a dying man, and in his last couple of years, he was dying of diabetes. He kind of had like I would say, kind of a redemption arc where he, you know, found Jesus or whatever you want to say. He became spiritual, came to regret a lot of things he did, and wanted to make things right in the world. So I thought he was very interesting, and I think what's really behind is there's my story of my fictional characters, but there's a lot of real characters in it. I think Braxton Bragg is a very interesting person. I think General Thomas, who was a Southerner who but fought for the North, and these characters are in the book, and I think I tell their stories and bring them back to life.
Yes, very well said, Mr. Cody. But before we go on, I'm inviting you to listen to my other podcast, Food 101, our third season, with Chef Alessandro, one of the best executive chef in one of the best restaurant in downtown Toronto. And listen to our latest episode. We talk about gelato, people, because summer is hot, hot, hot. So please do listen. Food 101 plus one more. Our book is out already. Food 101 Volume 1 Basics is all about the basic that you need to create a delicious food. But not only Volume 1, we did Volume 2, which is Fundamentals. Volume 3 is Essentials, and I have a lot of volumes coming, so please grab your copy, available on Amazon and leading online bookstores worldwide. Mr. Cody, Blood for Blood at Nashville, what's the best highlight?
The best highlight, I want to say it's the epilogue because the story, like I said, I feel like it's a very satisfying ending for not only my story with my characters, but also with the American Civil War and the Western Theater. But in the epilogue, we also wrap up several different loose threads that and I think it's very. I, I think it's very satisfying. I like the story of General Thomas, the Rock of Chickamauga, and there's a bittersweet story about two of my characters, Jerry and Elijah, and you kind of get your last time with them, and then of course the kind of the last bit with Nathan Bedford Forrest and one of my characters, Kyle, who basically comes to Memphis 10 years later to kill Forrest. But, I won't let you All I'll tell you is that my character comes to kill him, but is surprised by what he finds when he comes to Memphis to do so.
Oh, interesting, Mr. Cody. What do you think the flaws are missing?
I go through a lot of extensive rewriting, and I have quite a process, and we're going to talk about this process a little bit more next week. That's a little preview right there. But when I write, every time I sit down, I to write, I reread what the last thing I wrote, and I fix things, and then every chapter I go through and I reread. When I finish a chapter, I reread it and I fix things. I write it, and then of course, once I'm done with the whole book, I go through it. So I really did a lot of fine tuning, a lot of editing, and I'm really happy with that book. I mean, I'm immensely proud of it. It's one of the greatest achievements of my life. So Daniel, I wouldn't change a thing. I really wouldn't. I don't regret anything. There's nothing that I left out that I wish I would have put in. You know what? I gave myself the time. And that's one of the great things about I'm an independent author. That's one of the great things is that I'm the only person who's giving myself deadlines, and I'm pretty strict with it. I'm pretty tough with myself. I don't have other people changing things or telling me to do this or do that. It's a pure effort. Like for example, I had a friend of mine used to say that a camel is a horse designed by committee, and I think too many. And as you know, with cooking, too many chefs spoil the soup, right?
Yes.
So this is something. Now I definitely take advice, and I take I look at some of the critiques I've gotten from readers from my other books. I take all that kind of stuff in account. I have my girlfriend and my mom I talk to quite a bit about the plot and listen to what they got to say. So I think in the end, and they also work as my editors. So in the end, I think we really put together a great book, a great story. And the great thing is, every one of my books, even though they're all connected, you don't have to necessarily read them in order. You could, if you just want to read Blood for Blood, go ahead and read it. Now, I would like you to read the whole series because I feel like the overall thing is a bigger arc. But I'm very proud of it, and I wouldn't change a thing.
So, Blood for Blood at Nashville is your favorite novel.
I guess it would be hard to say because all of them are special to me, every single one. Um, I think they get better and better as I go. My favorite, I would say, um, I would say Perils of Perryville is not my best book, but there's something about it. I'll tell you what it is, Daniel. You measure your success by return customers, right? And the dangers of writing a series is that if people don't like the first book, they're not going to read the second book or the third book or the fourth book, right? That's the thing. You want to bring if you write a series, it's great if people like the first book and like the subsequent ones. But if they don't, you're screwed. You're writing dead books. And so I'm always very excited when I see Perils of Perryville do well, and of course Blood for Blood and Mexico My Love, because what that means is that people have read the first book, Rampage on the River, and it was worth not only their money but their time. It takes time and commitment to read a novel, and there's a million novels out there, and a lot of really good writers. Like for example, Baptiste Pinson-Wu, you've interviewed him. I read his first book; it's fabulous. So the fact that people come back and read book two uh, fills me with delight, and the fact that people come back and read book three and four fills me with delight, and I can see it because I'm an independent. I have direct control. I can look at my sales from Amazon on a daily basis, and I can see on KEMP. So if you have Kindle Unlimited, all my books are there, and I can see all four of my novels are constantly being read. All four of my novels are constantly selling. A lot of times, people when I do sell books in person, I do a lot of book talks and I do Civil War shows, and a lot of times people will buy the whole series from me right there on the spot. So The reason why I like the second book so much is that every time I see it sell, it's proof to me that I got off to the right start and I'm on the right track.
I think so, Mr. Cody, and very well said. So
Thank
let's
you.
talk about all of your books and describe them. I will name your novel and give me two adjectives. Okay, the American Civil War was about slavery.
That is informative and brief.
Okay, Rampage on the River, the Battle for Island number 10.
It is the beginning of the adventure, full of romance and swashbuckling fun.
And of course, Mexico, my love, a tragic love story and swashbuckling adventure.
Yes, and that's exactly it because it is the story of my main character's parents. So you learn a little bit of their story. Carl grows up without a father, and in the end of Perils of Perryville, he learns the truth about who his father was. And so Mexico, My Love is the tragic love story about his parents, how they meet, fall in love, and run away together. And, it's written, it's a lot, very Greek. It's very much like a Greek tragedy because the characters are aware, and so is the reader, that this ends in tragedy. And so, and I think it creates a certain kind of tension and foreshadowing through the book. So, yeah, absolutely one of my greatest works of all time.
Yes, the Perils of Perryville.
Perils of Perryville is all about consequences. You can go on an adventure and do something, but the next day there are consequences. And Perils of Perryville is also expansive. So Rampage on the River, Battle for Island number 10 was a very, straightforward story. Perils of Perryville starts expanding on that, and it starts giving, there's a character named Catherine that you meet in Rampage on the River. She becomes one of the main characters in Rampage on Perils of Perryville. So it takes that story, Rampage, and it makes it a bigger story.
Yes, indeed, and Blood for Blood at Nashville.
Friendship, revenge, and love.
Oh, just like Alexander Dumas, Monte Cristo.
Absolutely. Yep.
Oh my goodness, you are the grandson of Alexander.
In spirit, I am. Yes, sir.
Definitely. So, Mr. Cody, can you please invite our listeners to buy all your books?
Yes, please do. I'll tell you, I write books. Okay, so I was an early reader, and when I was 12 years old, I was reading adult books, and I loved anything that had to do with swords and sword fighting and honor and military in the past and history. And so I am writing books for that 12-year-old boy that I used to be. And even though my books are written for adults, if your kid is sophisticated enough to read books, they're fine for your kids. But what the person I'm writing for is that boy inside every adult who gets excited about action adventure, who gets excited about sword fights and muskets and stories of bravery and honor. And and I'm writing to my own inner child, and I'm writing to the children that are inside my adult readers. So if you loved black and white Errol Flynn stories, if you loved the the Three Musketeers and the Count of Monte Cristo, I'm writing the book. I'm writing your books. I am your modern day Alexander Dumas.
Very well said, Mr. Cody. And thank you for your talents that you share
Thank
to
you.
us. Thank you for your novels. And I hope more novels to come.
They're coming. I'm writing book 5 right now.
That's awesome. Interesting. Mr. Cody, next week we're going to talk about your last book.
Yeah, this is what I was talking about before a little bit about my process. Okay. Now, let me
Yes.
tell you something because I know a lot of you listening right now, a lot of you listening are either authors or people who have dreamt about writing your first book and publishing it. And I'm telling you right now, I was just like you. I didn't start writing I didn't publish my first book till much later in life, about 5 years ago. I spent a lifetime uh, dreaming about writing books. I wrote probably 5 chapters of a book back in the 1990s that I never finished. One day I said, you know what? I got to do it. If I don't start writing now, I'm never going to do it. So I need to just do it or shut up about it. Okay. I'm telling you right now, it does not take particular talent to write a book. It takes particular dedication. You don't sit down and write a book in a day. You sit down and write every day for months and months and months, and you edit and you struggle and you go through writer's block and you go through self-doubt and you go through all sorts and mistakes and having to rewrite and having people critique it and not liking what they're hearing. I did it. You can do it too. I put together a book and called How to Write, Publish, and Market Your Novel. It's on Amazon. It's very cheap. It's $1.99 in the US. I don't know what it is in the UK and the other countries, but it's comparable to $2 all over the world for the digital version. The print version, I think, is under $5. It's very cheap. It's not very long. It started off as a series of articles that I had on a blog spot. Now I've taken those down and reformatted them into a book. And so what we do is we go each chapter. We start with how to come up with ideas, where to get how to develop them into an outline, a good work method of how to organize your work so that a little bit every day goes a long way. How to My method of editing it, and then how to get it published. And then once you publish, by the way, people think publishing a book is the end of the journey. It's the beginning. You are. I mean, what do you think I'm doing right now? I am marketing my books to all you lovely people, and marketing is a big thing. So there's a lot. There's a lot of insight on that. And then here's the best part about it. I really do care about other writers, and I do a lot to help promote other writers. I have a Facebook group called Engdahl House of Readers and Writers, and I urge you to join if you're a reader or a writer, and to post your links to your books there. I'm constantly promoting other people's books there. And one of the things I did in this book, How to Write, Publish, and Market Your Novel, in the end, I said, hey, if you read this book and you did the things I said and you got a book published, I want to know about it. I want to know. And I had a young man get a hold of me and said, Mr. Engdahl, I bought your book. I did everything you said, and I published my book. I'm so proud. I have some questions. Is it okay if I ask you? And I said, absolutely. I'm here for you, man. So if you are dreaming about getting your book published, dreaming about writing your first book, I'm here to help, and we're going to talk about it. We're gonna get into the weeds next week. Daniel and I, we're going to talk about the book. I would say, I want you to go out and buy all my books, but
Yes.
the digital one is $2. It's nothing. Or get the print one. Go out and get it. Go out and get it right now. Look it over, and then next week, we can. We'll talk about it in depth. And I'll tell you what. If you go out there and you buy that book and you read through it and you got questions, why don't you send them to Mr. Daniel here? He's got he's on all the social media. He's on Twitter, and I'll answer them.
Yes, definitely next week, people. If you're interested, how to write, publish, and market your novel, please do listen tune in next week, because this is really interesting for those people aspiring to be a writer. So, Mr.
Yeah.
Cody, what will be your encouragement for those want to be a writer?
I would say that you don't have to sit down and spend 8 hours writing on Sunday. If you can write a little bit every day, you'll be surprised at how quickly that adds up. So That's a little hint of what the book is about and the things, the techniques and the strategies that I use. And I'm about to, I'm writing my fifth novel right now. I have six. Yeah, I got six books. I got two nonfictions, four novels. I'm writing probably about 2/3 into writing my fifth novel. I love it. It's a great life, and I'm telling you, once you write your first novel, you're hooked for life. You'll be writing novels for the rest of your life, and there's success, some form of success for everybody, if long as you're willing to put in the work. So we're going to talk about that next week.
Yes, people, once again, thank you for your time, Mr. Cody.
You're welcome.
And tune in next week because we have interesting topic. And if you want to participate, please do participate. I'm gonna leave the email, or you can shout out on my Instagram, on my Twitter, LinkedIn, and a lot more, or to Mr. Cody itself. Right, Mr.
Yep.
Cody?
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I'm the only Cody C. Engdahl out there. You're welcome, sir. Thank you. Thanks for everything you do. And everybody, give Daniel a round of applause and give him some support, man. He's got some great books out there.
Yes, thank you so much, Mr. Cody. And more to come, people. See you soon.